Hello, my name is Eric Wigglespecht, and this is another entry in my Learning Out Loud video series where I talk about past or current projects and look at the code that makes them work. Today we're looking at the Kanban task tracker again, and we're at the point now where I have everything looking the way it's supposed to look, and I have started implementing some of the functionality. So let's actually make this bigger here and we can take a look. I'll change this new column button eventually. But now we've got a board here that we're looking at with a bunch of our tasks. We can open up one of the tasks. We have our current status here to do, and we can select one of these, and we're on our build UI for onboarding flow. If I select doing, now it moves my build UI for onboarding flow down to the doing column. Let's move a couple more of these. Build settings, drops down to doing. We can move this one over to done, and you see that it appears over here. So that's awesome, and I'm super happy about how this works. And I want to talk about some of the things I did to make this work. So if you've been following along with the series, you may recall our data is kind of insane. But this isn't uncommon, right? So we've got a large, deeply nested object here and arrays and all that. So a deeply nested state that we're working with. So I wanted to work, this is how Front-End Mentor provided the data to me, and I kind of wanted to just make sure I made it work that way. I didn't want to change around the data structure. I just wanted to implement it as it was provided. And when we make a backend for this thing, I'll just pass the object back and forth, and it'll be a lot easier to store that information and pass things around. And all of the manipulation will be handled on the front end, which will be nice. So this is a lot, right? And we've got an object that has a boards array, and each object within that array is our board. Like here's platform launch board, and each of those objects has a columns array, which has a column object, which has task array and task objects and subtask objects. The thing to remember, I'm using React for this. The thing to remember about React is when using state, state is immutable in React, right? Meaning that if we were just using vanilla JavaScript, we could just go into these objects, your dot notation, and access one of these things down here and just change is completed to true or something like that. In our case, change the status here from to do to doing or something like that, and then splice this off of this array and then push it onto our doing array. With React, we can't do that, right? Since we're using a state, it's not, it is immutable, so we can't just go in and make those changes without first making a copy of the object. And you may be familiar with the spread operator. So let's go into the app, which is my top level here of my whole project flow. And you can see, like here, I am making a copy of something, right, using the spread operator. And that's great. So in smaller, more flat data structures, making a copy using the spread operator won't necessarily be too difficult. But with this JSON object, we have, this boards and then an array, right? So if I were to just try to make, let copy equal and do this, let's call this my board data equals that, right? If I were to come in here to say let copy equal ... board data, if I can spell board correctly, this isn't actually going to create a copy of the entire nested object, right? This is really just going to spread the first part of our object, right? Or, because each one of these, like this object here, is an object in memory. This isn't actually quote-unquote contained within this larger object. It's another object that exists somewhere in memory, and the tasks array, we're just pointing out to that, right? This isn't actually contained there. These are all objects in memory somewhere. This thing isn't one big solid object. It's a bunch of individual objects which exist separately in memory. So if we really wanted to copy this thing, we'd have to spread every single level of this gigantic nested object, and that's a lot of code and be very verbose and hard to follow, and very prone to making errors. So while researching what to do in this situation with a large nested object, there is a suggestion of flattening your object, which you can do, but you still have to go through a lot of effort to flatten it out and make maybe reference points to different things and or ID numbers. But I thought that would be a lot of work, so I kept searching and found a library called Immer, IMMR, which I highly recommend if you're using React and deeply nested objects in state. What Immer does for us is it allows us to use what they call their produce function. Well, we can look at one thing here, right? Where we can just, as you would think you can do in normal JavaScript land, you can do it here using produce. And what it does is you take your object or your array, whatever it is, you put in, you pass in that object, you pass in what's called draft, where you can name it whatever you want to name it. And then Immer does all of that spread syntax process for you, makes all of your copies and everything you want to do, and then you can update it directly within the Immer produce function, and then it returns your updated draft, right? So we'll look at here what I have going on. So in my app, my top level, which is where my board data lives, which right now I just have that here, and I'm passing a lot of props down, which I don't really love at the moment, but I might just leave as is just to get this project done, and then maybe later on if I have more time go update things and maybe put things in context, but we'll see. So board data starts here. We map through our boards array and we return a board view component, which I'm passing in not just the board but also index, which will then allow me to just, rather than having to search through this nested object and do find index on every single thing, I'm going to be able to pass some data back into a function I wrote. So we're passing in the board, we're passing in our set board data, and we're passing in the index of the board that is being mapped. And then we pass down to column. Actually, let me go look at board view first. Here's board view. We're going to do the same thing in our column component where we pass in the board index that we have from the level above and our new column index that we generate here and our board data and set board data. So now we go look at column, we pass that down again, and now we have our task preview card, which are these little cards. And within the task preview card, we have our actual task view card, which is where some of the magic here is happening. We also we have subtask here. I'm sorry, status select here is where we're actually making that change, right? When we select our drop down and we have our to do, doing, done. So in status select, we're actually calling an event handler, right? On the on change, we are passing a function in here, which we'll look at in a second, and we pass back e.target.value. So just whatever one we end up selecting, we're passing that back up to a function that exists on task view card. And here's where it gets passed back up to, right? So I'm passing in new status, which is to do or doing or done, whatever one we select. And then we're saying let result equal update task status, which we'll look at in a second. It's a function that exists in another file. And we pass in our current board data. We pass in the board index, so whatever board we're on, the column index, whatever column we're currently in, and the task index, whatever task we're currently selecting. So all those, that task now has all that data and knows where it lives in our gigantic data structure, passes that back to this function, and also passes back that new status, that string that we just selected to do doing whatever. And we're going to pass all that into this update task status function, which that lives in my utility file over here that I've called Immer functions. And I've got a bunch of notes over here that we need to do eventually, right? Some other functionality on these tasks. But right now what we have is our update task status, right? So in effect, we're just taking our task, we're updating it from to do, to doing, to whatever. So here we pass in our board data, and you can see I've got all these things typed out here with TypeScript. We pass in our board index, our column index, our task index, and our new status. So regardless of what task we're adjusting, all that information is passed back over to this function. And this is where we use Immer, right? So rather than have to make a copy of the object, the deeply nested object that's in state, which is currently immutable, rather than having to make a copy and make this code gigantic, Immer takes care of that for me. So I can use the produce function and pass in board data. And then my second argument here is the draft, which is what we're going to be adjusting within Immer. And then I can just do all my standard object adjustments as I would with normal JavaScript if we didn't have to worry about these things being immutable, right? So let task to update is our draft.boards of board index. All right, let's actually look at, I'm going to pull this out, and let's look at the JSON file at the same time. So this will make a little more sense, hopefully, in concept. And let's get that so it's a little more visible. So we splice out the task that we're going to update, right? And we're just going to use splice here on this thing. So we know we have what we're going to work with draft now, which is going to be our copy of our deeply nested object. Draft.boards, here's our boards, of board index. So we know we're working with 1, or 0 in this case, sorry. It will pass back 0 because we're on the first board in this array, platform launch. And we have dot columns here, and we know it passed back the column index, which in this case is 0, so we're working on the first object in that columns array. Dot tasks, here are dot tasks, and then we splice, because this is an array here of objects, and we splice whatever that task index number is. In this case, build UI was 0, and we're only splicing one object, so we just say 1. That's our task to update. Splice returns an array of this, right? So task to update of array 0, position 0 in that array, dot status, we update to our new status that we passed in based on our selection. And then the only finding we're doing now, since I passed all that other stuff back, the only finding that we're doing is where we are moving this to based on the new status that we received, right? So if I received doing, this exists in the columns to do right now. We move it over to the doing column. So we just first get our columns array from the board that we're on, draft.boards, board index column. So boards of board 0 columns, and then we do our columns array find index. For each column that we have in that array, we look at column.name, here's to do, then we have doing, and once we find a matching name, column.name equals the new status that we passed in, that is the index we'll be pushing into within that board. Hopefully this is making sense. Then we draft.boards of board index, of column, of that column index position that we just found, task.push, our task that we just made our adjustment to that we spliced off. And then what this does now is Immer returns our copied and updated nested object into this updated board variable we declared, and we return updated board, which goes back to task view card, which we have now called result. So that updated object, nested object, is captured in result, and we pass result to set board data. Whew, it is a lot, but it's also a lot less work because of Immer than we would have had to do otherwise, and it makes these functions and these updates on this deeply nested object way more simplistic than I was thinking I was going to have to do, and I'm extremely happy to have found Immer, and I'll be using that for all the updates on this thing. So hopefully the next steps of this will go rather quickly, and then we can have a finished product hopefully soon, because I've put in not a whole lot of time. A lot of the time went on this just building out the static pages. The functionality here I think is going to be a lot more simplistic and easier to build out. But we're doing this in React style, right? And when you Work with React. It is always recommended to build out your static pages first based on data, pass down your props, and then look at where your state should live and how state should be handled, pass state down as needed, and then build in your functionality. So here we are. Hopefully some of you out there can find some help with Immer on your own projects. If you have any questions, let me know. Definitely check out the Immer documentation. It is extremely helpful and it's a wonderful tool. So thank you for joining in. We'll see you next time.